What really is the priority of the Chinese and U.S. relations right now in terms of foreign policy? Is Taiwan going to be a pivotal factor in determining this relationship going forward? And what exactly is going on with the Inflation Reduction Act that's supposed to be voted on today by the House? We're speaking today on Friday, the 12th of August. And joining us to discuss these issues is an expert on geopolitics and foreign policy. He is Matt Gertken, Geopolitical Strategy Chief Strategist at BCA Research. Welcome back to the show, Matt. Always great to have you.
Thank you, David. Great to be here with you all.
We're going to start by talking about U.S.-China relations. So let's recap Nancy Pelosi's visit last week or a week and a half ago to Taiwan. From my understanding, the White House has denied any official sanctioning of this visit. Is that correct, Matt?
I mean, it really wouldn't matter if they denied it. We know that the United States military helped to escort and provide Pelosi's trip. So it's clear that the White House was involved and coordinated on this trip. And the purpose underlying the noise is that the United States needs to increase deterrence around Taiwan in the wake of the Ukraine war. We don't want a situation in which the U.S. fails to stick up for its partners and allies, and then, of course, incentivizes other powers to put pressure on them in the way that occurred between Russia and Ukraine.
Well, tensions between China and the U.S. have in some ways escalated over the last couple of years. If you want to take a longer term perspective, some would argue that this is just really poor timing from the White House and Nancy Pelosi's part. Would you agree with that sentiment?
What's critical about the timing is that it precedes the midterm election. So what you're seeing is that the Biden administration is willing to take foreign policy risks because he can either get some victories that'll help the Democratic Party in the midterm, or if there's a crisis event, well, Americans will rally around the flag, and that also will help the Democratic Party. So it's kind of a playbook that is reminiscent of 1962, when John F. Kennedy was really in bad straits. The stock market had fallen, the economy was recovering from a recession. Democrats were in trouble. But then the Cuban Missile Crisis occurred, and in fact, the Democrats did about as well as you can do in a midterm election year if you're the ruling party. So that's the kind of playbook. And look at the Chinese side quickly. The National Party Congress is taking place where Xi Jinping wants to consolidate power for another 5 or 10 years. He's also willing to beat his chest and flex his muscles ahead of that event. So both sides are willing to play the Taiwan issue for domestic strength. And then the question for all of us next year is, does that continue? Because if it does, that means it wasn't just about domestic politics. It means that actually real relations over Taiwan are getting much more dangerous.
Okay, so I want to ask you about the ramifications of not just this visit, but the larger China policy towards later on in this interview. But first, let's revisit the Taiwan Relations Act. Nancy Pelosi wrote about this act in her op-ed with the Washington Post. And she was talking about America's unequivocal commitment to protecting Taiwan. I think there needs to be some clarity around what exactly these commitments are, because from my understanding, should a military provocation happen in the South China Sea, either from Taiwan's part or from China's part, the U.S. does not have an obligation to actually step in militarily. They only have the obligation to provide arms. Is that correct?
Yes, that's correct. The U.S. uses these terms, these rhetorical terms like rock solid support or unequivocal support. But the truth is that it exactly is equivocal. It exactly is ambivalent and ambiguous. And the reason is because for issues that took place during the Cold War, the U.S. had to kind of partner up with China and open up the Chinese economy. That meant that they had to downgrade relations with Taiwan and get rid of the Mutual Defense Treaty. So there is no Mutual Defense Treaty. And then nowadays, of course, as U.S. and China diverge and China really challenges U.S. leadership, the U.S. is kind of, trying to provide deterrence, but we don't have that same commitment. And so it's a situation similar to Ukraine because Taiwan is basically falling through the cracks. They don't have a defense guarantee from the U.S. They are a security threat to China. And China does have the capability ultimately to try to do something about it.
Okay, so let's just role play a few scenarios and I guess speculate as to what the U.S. might do. So in the worst case scenario, in which China attacks Taiwan by force, either through an invasion or through missile attacks or airstrikes, what would be the appropriate or I guess necessary U.S. response?
Well, it's a really tough question. I think first of all, the U.S. would absolutely respond with large-scale economic sanctions, like we saw in the case when Russia invaded Ukraine. And I think the U.S. could even threaten to impose a blockade on China, depending on how quickly they escalated. The other element, and I think the really tough call, would be whether the U.S. would involve itself militarily in very strict and limited actions to defend Taiwan, but not do anything offensive against China. I think that's a pretty tough call. That's hard to say. But one thing is sure, in the 3 Taiwan Strait crises previous to this year, and probably also this year, the U.S. has taken a robust military presence in the region. Normally, we send an aircraft carrier through the Taiwan Strait. That's what happened in the 3 Taiwan Strait crises earlier. That could very well happen over the next month or two. And so, in other words, the U.S. has signaled amply for 70 years that we will, in fact, involve our military to some degree.
Just off topic for a bit, let's talk about that because, yeah, in '96, Clinton sent an aircraft carrier group into the Strait of Taiwan after China sent over some missiles in defiance of Taiwan's, I guess, rebellious nature. They voted in the New Democratic Party, which was pro-independence. And now, fast forward 20 odd years, analysts are speculating, we're saying that China now has the capability of deterring aircraft carrier strike groups. They could potentially sink a carrier. So this strategy is not going to work from the U.S. anymore. Would you agree with that sentiment?
I'm not so sure. I mean, China would be really biting off a lot if they sank a U.S. aircraft carrier. That's like declaring war on the United States of America, which still remains
could they do
the most powerful country.
I mean, no one's going to try, but could they do it?
Oh, yeah. They have the capability to sink a carrier, especially if it's right off their shores. And, so that's where we get into the issue of how will the Biden administration respond? Because, we talk about the status quo. Like, for example, the U.S. and China maintain a status quo of relations or the one China policy. We see that, for instance, House Speaker Newt Gingrich had gone in 1997. So then the U.S. invokes that as a precedent. That's part of the status quo. Therefore, we can send Pelosi. But China, of course, has a different interest. They want to, they want to shape that status quo going forward in a way that the U.S. really can't do any major new commitments in terms of Taiwan's defense capability or the military balance. But anyway, the Americans will come in and let's say they don't have the nerve to put an aircraft carrier in the strait. Well, they'll just put it on the other side of Taiwan, which they've done several times just in recent years, or they'll put it in the Senkaku Islands, which are disputed with Japan. The point is the same, that the U.S. is still leaving it ambiguous as to whether we would get involved. And then that will help to put the thumb on the scales with regard to China's own reasoning.
Well, there was no ambiguity over whether or not the U.S. was directly involved with the war of Ukraine in terms of putting boots on the ground. Maybe they spent some spec ops groups behind the scenes. Maybe they sent military equipment. But we didn't see U.S. troops en masse in Ukraine. That sends a message to China that perhaps they won't step in to fight for Taiwan, right?
They're different situations. I think China would take the wrong message if they did draw that conclusion, because the odds of U.S. military involvement are much higher with regard to Taiwan. But your first statement that there is no mutual defense treaty is true, and that is an analogy with Ukraine that's valid. Okay,
fair enough. What if Taiwan were to join China through a peaceful negotiation? Not similar to Hong Kong. That was a different scenario. Hong Kong was governed by the British. But suppose the KMT party were to come into power sometime down the line. Now, the KMT party, the Kuomintang party, is pro or at least more open to the concept or the idea of reunification. Suppose they strike a deal, have a referendum. Suppose the Taiwanese vote actually to join China. A little bit of a stretch, but suppose that were to happen. I mean, it would kind of look back for the Americans to do absolutely nothing, right?
Well, actually, let's take that a different way. So first of all, the KMT could come back into power. I mean, Taiwan is a democracy, and there have been global economic shocks. Right now, the ruling party, Tsai Ing-wen, the president, and the Democratic Party are doing okay. But we have midterm elections in November in Taiwan as well as the U.S. We don't know the results of that yet. We also know we have a presidential election in 2024. So from China's point of view, it would make sense to see the outcome of these elections before deciding to do something as risky as invading Taiwan. And I think that's a very critical point that's probably being missed in some of the discussions today. But having said that, if the Taiwanese vote in favor of the current leadership and the U.S. continues to try to increase deterrence, then China may feel that their window of opportunity is closing. Because
Correct.
what they don't want to have happen is for the U.S. to extend a security guarantee to Taiwan, and that's a risk. So in other words, they're incentivized to take action prior to that time in the way that Russia was incentivized to take action on Ukraine before they ever joined NATO. And so I think that's the key dynamic there. I don't think we'll have a popular referendum on Taiwanese independence because I think China would see that as a no-go zone.
Interesting. Okay, that's an interesting analysis, Matt. Okay, we know what China's objective is. It's to reunify with Taiwan. They've been unambiguous about that. It's a cornerstone of their policy, both domestic and foreign. What is the U.S. objective? Is it to prevent reunification? What exactly is the U.S. trying to do here is, I think, the bigger question.
No, I think if we analyze U.S. policy fairly over the past 50 years, it's incorrect to say that the U.S. Policy is to prevent reunification. I think the U.S. policy has been fairly consistent. It's to prevent unification by arms, by force.
Okay.
Basically, the U.S. just says you cannot attack Taiwan and try to unify that way. Now, the problem is, of course, China says that they can. And ultimately, in terms of capabilities, that's a game of chicken that China will win. China can always take much greater risks and suffer much greater devastation on that particular issue than the U.S. is willing to do, because Taiwan is so critical to the geography and the national security of China.
Okay, that's interesting. Now, Matt, what exactly is the strategic value of Taiwan to the U.S.? Some people who are, I guess, more pro-isolationism would argue that the U.S. really has no business being in that region in the first place. So clearly there must be some importance to the Americans, to the White House.
Well, the U.S. is in the region because when nations have attempted to create an Asian empire, they have attacked the United States. That's what Japan did, and so that's why we fought World War II, and that's how we ended up in the region. And we supported the Chinese legitimate government at the time, which was the Kuomintang, ruled by the Kuomintang, and they were exiled, so we retained our support for that regime. We had a mutual defense treaty until 72. Now we just support them with arms, as you've outlined. So I think the U.S. does have plenty of business in the Western Pacific based on the way that things have developed over the past century. But the question then is, what is the U.S. interest? And I think that's a very good question. A few things. First of all, the U.S. wants to remain anchored in the region. We don't want a new empire to emerge that could then threaten or challenge the U.S. We also want to protect our allies. Both Japan and South Korea depend on supply lines that go through the Taiwan Strait. And so any power like China that could attack the Taiwan Strait or control that waterway, China claims that as sovereign waters, that would hurt our allies and also potentially hurt U.S. broader security. And then the other element there is, of course, there's an economic component. And that's where Taiwan, of course, is critical, much more important to U.S. economy than Ukraine, for example, particularly because of computer chips. Yes. But really, it mostly has to do with the security architecture of the entire region. And that boils down to U.S. presence in Japan and South Korea, Philippines, and partnership with Taiwan.
Well, from my understanding, Matt, the U.S. currently doesn't have a large or any military presence in Taiwan right now. I mean, they used to during the Korean War, but from my understanding, they don't really have for any troops there now. Would you make the argument, or could you argue against this statement, that should Taiwan reunify with China, it would significantly weaken U.S. presence strategically, geopolitically in that region? Would it make a huge difference is basically my question.
Yeah, it would. But like I said, it's like I said, there's a partnership between the U.S. and Taiwan. And we have had some Marines there doing training in recent years, which I think has ruffled China's feathers. But you're correct that this is not an issue with Taiwan. This is not an issue of the U.S. presence in terms of troops in the region.
Sure.
But what it is an issue of the security of U.S. allies in the region. Because Japan, for example, will be deeply threatened if China unifies by force. That's because Japan imports their food and fuel. That goes through those sea lines of communication that would be obstructed. China would basically have a veto over Japan's economy. And Japan won't allow that to happen. Those are historic rivals, China and Japan. Japan, of course, depends on the U.S. for security. And the U.S. doesn't want the region to be destabilized. The U.S. doesn't want also for China to form a sphere of influence that includes Korea and Japan and the Philippines and those areas. So basically, the U.S. will support its allies, and it probably will limit its support for Taiwan. And we hit on that earlier today. I think that's critical. And then the question is whether China decides to take that and run with it the way that Russia did. If they do, it's going to be very bad for everyone in the world, bad for the economy, bad for markets, but it won't be good for the Chinese. It's obviously an example of them. If they did that, it would be turning their back on the prosperity of recent decades and instead going down a path of Maoism and confrontation with the rest of the world.
All right. Well, a few more questions on China. We'll move on. How would you characterize or summarize the relationship between the Chinese and the Americans right now? Is it one of cooperation? Is it one of outright hostility? And what would you say is a priority of the Biden administration right now in regards to foreign policy with China?
Well, it's not outright hostility, but it definitely is a turning point over the past roughly 8 years, 10 years. We've seen that the U.S. and China are no longer engaging the way that they did between 1972 and 2008. And that's going to continue. So we're not engaging, we're disengaging our economies. But we're not at the point of overall hostilities because no one has attacked anyone or even really signaled that they're going to attack anyone. Of course, China leaves open the possibility of forceful reunification. But the U.S., of course, doesn't. We're going to tread very carefully there. And China, of course, is also gesturing. That's why I say that these saber rattling now, you could characterize as part of the game that the two sides have played many times. There's a domestic political aspect on both sides, the party Congress and the midterm election. But that's why I'm concerned about next year. Because if Xi Jinping consolidates power at the party Congress and then he goes and reboots the economy, well, that tells you that we really are still in the status quo. But if he consolidates power and then continues to expand economic sanctions on Taiwan and make preparation for eventual war, then the U.S. is going to have to tighten our economic sanctions and export controls on China. And we're going to be in an escalatory environment that's extremely dangerous next year. So I think we're at a critical turning point. I think that status quo will be maintained at least for the next couple of years. Right. But I would say over the long run, it's not looking good at all.
Okay. Well, I think you and I have spoken about this briefly in the past, the Thucydides trap, the concept of perhaps an emerging power challenging an existing hegemon, in this case, the U.S. Graham Allison, American historian and political analyst, has analyzed, I think, 16 historical cases of this happening, of 12 of which have ended up in war. So my question is, should China emerge as a competing superpower? Is it likely that we could see armed conflict?
China has emerged as a competing superpower. They're converting their economic success into strategic success. And the U.S. has not figured out a way to respond to that. We're vacillating. The U.S. is divided. The political parties do not maintain a consistent foreign policy. Graham Allison is exactly right. I mean, this dynamic of a challenging power that tries to revise the global order usually leads to war. And he's done the work. He's done it best. But it's a phenomenon that anyone who studies international relations is familiar with. So that's why I say the long-term picture here is negative. Taiwan is completely unsustainable geopolitically. The idea that the U.S. provides weapons to what is basically a province of China. So this is not going to be resolved well. And the Taiwanese themselves have far greater sense of autonomy and identity than Hong Kong. They're on an island that at least theoretically could defend itself and be independent. And so that's a situation that's not resolvable. And that's why ultimately I think we probably, unfortunately, will have a conflict. The question for investors is whether this is it now, or whether the different sides will kick the can down the road. And I would still be on the side of kicking the can down the road based on what I've seen. But the party Congress in China this year will be a critical turning point to see what happens afterwards.
Perfect. You summarized the investment case quite well. One could argue then, but Matt, Soviet Union, that de-escalated. The whole Cold War with the Soviet Union, that didn't really lead to a hot war. It kind of just fizzled out. I mean, that's an understatement.
Well, I mean, no, but you're right. I mean, mutually assured destruction. It's an enormous rational. If nations are rational, they won't engage in nuclear warfare, and they won't engage in direct warfare that could lead to nuclear warfare. And in fact, in many war games, would lead to nuclear warfare. So that's a factor that we have to all consider. But what it results in, though, is not just a peachy world of globalization where we all go back to doing business. That's not what happens. Instead, what you end up with are proxy wars. And that's what the Cold War was all about. So it's the neighboring territories that are disrupted. And so that means South Korea, Taiwan, Vietnam, probably the Philippines. Those are economies that are going to continue to be upset by political vacillations within as their countries try to balance, and also proxy wars. Philippines is lucky. South Korea is lucky. They already have a defense treaty with the U.S., but Taiwan and Vietnam do not. And so that's why they're vulnerable in the way that Ukraine was.
Interesting. All right. We'll revisit this topic another time, Matt. Let's talk about the Inflation Reduction Act passed by the Senate, not yet passed by the House, although they're voting on it today on Friday. So let's revisit some of the terms that have been suggested. So in total, $437 billion of investments have been proposed, of which $369 billion is for energy and climate change. Affordable Care Act extension is $64 billion. Western drought resiliency is $4 billion. The total revenue that they're expecting to raise from this act is $737 billion, of which $200 billion is coming from 15% corporate minimum tax. Overall, they're anticipating a $300 billion deficit reduction. So could you maybe walk through some of the items here and maybe outline in layman terms what the priority here right now is?
Yeah. Okay, so here's how to understand this. So remember, the Democrats had a very broad spending wish list at the beginning of their blue sweep in 2021 when they controlled all the legislature in the White House. They weren't able to pass that bill because Senator Joe Manchin rejected it. He was worried about inflation. Manchin was absolutely right. He was proven right by inflation. Therefore, the Democratic leadership went back to Manchin, and they tailored a bill toward exactly what he thought would win over the West Virginia voters. And that's, in a way, the median voter of the U.S., at least as represented in the Senate. And that's what they're now passing in order to chase that median voter and try to win or at least mitigate their losses in the midterm election. Now, the way the bill works is effectively you raise a corporate minimum tax. And that's something that the Biden administration negotiated around the world as well. So we're kind of bringing ourselves in line with what we negotiated around the world to try to prevent countries from undercutting each other on corporate tax. Americans in general are going to agree that companies should pay a minimum level of tax rather than being able to go and use loopholes and things. So in other words, that minimum tax will pay for climate subsidies. Then there's an extension of the Affordable Care Act subsidies, which were expanded, during the crisis, the pandemic. That's going to be paid for basically by bulking up the Internal Revenue Service so that they can crack down on tax evasion and gather more tax revenue under existing law. Okay, so then all you have left is these savings that the government thinks they can make if they have the Medicare system be able to negotiate. If Medicare can negotiate drug prices, it can push down drug prices, and then that will save public money. And that's where you get the deficit reduction. But here's the thing. The deficit is not being reduced all that dramatically here. There's a tiny, drop in the bucket reduction next year. Then, in fact, the climate subsidies kick in, and you have several years in which this is a net spending bill. So, in fact, it would be very small, but it would be stimulative. And then after that, in the latter part of the decade, you get those savings come in because of less government money spent on drugs. So that's an interesting argument then to claim that it's going to reduce inflation, because, in fact, what you've done is you basically passed a deficit neutral bill at best. But the next few years, in fact, you'll have these climate subsidies that are stimulative on the margin.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I'm looking through the document here that's it's been released by the government, updated as of yesterday. It says that there's a few things that the act aims to accomplish. You've outlined a few of them already. Another one here is interesting. Lowers energy bills. It's supposed to cut energy bills by $500 to $1,000 per year. I guess it means per household. How exactly would it do that?
Well, I think that hinges on the successes or failures of the renewable energy sector.
Okay.
And so that's the thing, is that there's a lot of very, political math, political arithmetic going on here.
Sure.
And I think a lot of the savings for the deficit are really the big ones are generated because of interest cost savings over the 2030s. So that's entirely unforeseeable what will really happen. And I think a similar thing could be argued with regard to energy. Most likely, I think these investments will be beneficial for generating renewable energy, and the private sector is already moving in that direction as well. Nevertheless, being able to put a number on exactly how much households are going to save from these renewable energy investments is obviously more of a political game. It's hard to predict.
Well, I think the average American looking at this is probably just wondering, well, 8.5% CPI with the latest headline CPI reading that came in last couple of days ago, Matt. What exactly is this bill, this act, going to do to that number? Is it going to lower it? Is it going to keep it the same? Have no impact? What do you think?
I don't think it'll have an impact on that number. I think, like, for example, the reason why the July inflation reading started to come down has to do with the fact that global commodity prices have come down because the global economy is softening, because the energy prices were too high earlier, right? So you just have a market that's balancing over time. And the reason inflation occurred was because of the combination of pandemic supply constraints with massive demand side stimulus passed by the US government and many years of ultra dovish monetary policy. So that's, we're getting a kind of cyclical reduction in inflation, but inflation will in fact then stabilize at a higher level than it used to be. And it'll be a persistent risk that it can rise in the future if the US doesn't control its spending, which it probably won't. We normally see new issues arise and governments spend a lot of money. The US deficit is projected to rise over the coming decade, notwithstanding this bill. And meanwhile, I think in terms of how this translates to reality, the long-term effects are going to depend on future governments, whether they run a disciplined budget. And if inflation is persistent, then you will have a political basis for cutting back on spending at different times. But right now, that's not the configuration of Congress. So you've got to see the midterm election happen, and then you see gridlock, and then you don't have the ability to do any more spending splurges. That will be disinflationary. And then you need to deal with your long-term drivers of inflation, which are actually fairly significant.
All right. Okay, let's follow up on the on talking about inflation next time. Matt, final question for you. So midterms, like you brought up, are coming up 3 months to be exact from now. What do you think is the administration's priority from now till then?
Well, clearly it's fighting inflation. And that's the thing, is that 8.5% headline inflation is bad, even though it ticked down. From a voter's point of view, that's a bad thing. And of course, core inflation didn't tick down either, right? So around early June, the Biden administration started targeting inflation to be their enemy number one. And that's where you saw Biden realized he needed to go to Saudi Arabia and try to get some more oil pumping there. He's trying to put together the Iran deal to get more Iranian oil. Those two things don't really gel. So, you're probably not going to see the oil markets globally provide a lot of help for him in time of the election. The Inflation Reduction Act, as we've talked about, it doesn't really reduce inflation. It's at best, it's deficit neutral in the short term. And in fact, if it perks up people's view of the economy, it could slightly help to stabilize inflation expectations. So, it's not really going to reduce inflation. Basically, he's depending on the Federal Reserve. That's the actor here that is going to be hiking rates still and ultimately reining in inflation. But even then, the Fed is not going to be able to do anything over the 3-month period before the election that drastically changes the view that we see. So I think the issue for the Democrats is that they're going into a midterm election when the ruling party almost always loses, and they've got 8.5% headline inflation. It's not a great combination. It's extremely likely that they will lose at least the House and that we will have a gridlocked environment for next year.
Final question, and I'll let you go. Now, how much of this rate hike that we've seen, with the rate hikes, plural, that we've seen, and maybe perhaps will see later on in the year, are politically driven? In other words, if let's suppose that the Congress doesn't have this objective of fighting inflation, do you think maybe Powell would just let things run and try to avoid a recession? I mean, it's a bit late, but, basically try to avoid a recession, just let it run.
Well, I don't think so. I don't think the Fed has been politicized this year. And in history, midterm elections, the Fed tends to kind of ignore them. But in 2024, though, that would be a different story because the Fed does pay attention to presidential elections, and Fed chairs are appointed by the president. So I think I think people are incorrect to claim that there is not a political element in the Federal Reserve. It is a political institution. It was created by the U.S. government, and as we talked about, it's appointed by the president. So it is a political entity, but it's also a professional and a technocratic entity, as are several other of the major central banks in the world. And they do fight for their independence as institutions, and they do have to answer to public opinion ultimately. So I think that that could be an issue of concern in 2024. But the truth is, the way things are shaping up, the Fed is having to hike now. Inflation is underlying the kind of brief pullback in inflation. We do have strong structural tailwinds for inflation. So the Fed's going to have to keep hiking. And they're going to try to get it all done in 2022 and 2023 so that in 2024, they're not really having to jack up interest rates, given that there's a presidential election.
That's understandable. All right. Thank you, Matt. You've been a great analysis today. So thank you for your time.
Appreciate it. Thank you, David.
Thank you for watching Kitco News. I'm David Lin.